Welcome everyone once again to this Twitter space. I'm Dmitry Alperovich, chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, a geopolitical think tank. And today, once again, I'm joined by two of the foremost experts on the Russian military. Michael Kofman is a research program director in the Russia Studies program at the Center for Naval Analysis, and Rob Lee is a senior fellow at the Eurasia Program of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. All right, well, let's once again get an update on the current status of the war. So, Rob, why don't we begin with you? What's the latest on the Russian advance? What has changed in the last week?
So over the last week, I'd say the situation of the advance hasn't changed that much. As we know, Russia's had more success in the south, but in the southwest portion, the city of Mykolaiv is still being held by Ukrainian forces. They've clearly had some success. Posted a couple of videos of them destroying or capturing a VDV D-30 artillery battalion, a number of other kind of vehicles they've captured or ambushed in that area. So far, we haven't seen a move towards Zaporizhia yet, although that's probably likely at some point. And then in Mariupol, Ukrainian forces there continue to hold out, even though they've been surrounded. Obviously, been quite a heavy bombardment. There was that bombardment of a maternity ward or hospital a few days ago. The city, is really being hit quite heavily, and there's issues. I think getting supplies, food, all those kind of things that people are living in the city. But as it remains right now, Ukrainian forces are holding out, and they continue to inflict loss on the Russian military. And we've seen a number of UAV videos published with the Azov battalion regiment showing Russian military losses, loss of T-72B3 tanks, BMP-3s, other kind of vehicles. So that fight continues. Not clear when that'll end. If Russia's going to be able to take that anytime soon, but clearly they're seeing quite heavy resistance there. In the northeast, most of the situation is mostly the same. Kharkiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, all holding out. Kharkiv, the bombardment, continues. It's almost a nightly basis, seeing really heavy MLRS fire, seeing aircraft, aviation bombing, all those kind of things. Quite a common occurrence still. It appeared there was a Russian aircraft shot down over Kharkiv today. Russia's continued to lose aircraft, both helicopters and fixed wing. And we don't have a total picture of Russian aviation losses, but they've clearly taken some not insignificant losses, and they continue to have issues there. And then around Kyiv, right, which is probably the most important area, Russian forces in the European Bucha, Hostomel region, kind of in the same position they've been. Still very heavy fighting there. There was so Ukrainian forces have still had success holding them back there. It appears Russian forces have pushed out a little farther west, trying to kind of to move out west, more farther to the west to help encircle the city. But still in that area, Ukrainian forces are holding out and being quite successful from everything you can tell. Some of the small towns to the northwest of Kyiv have really been devastated. A lot of destruction. A lot of towns have been mostly wiped off the map at this point. But ultimately, Ukrainian forces continue to hold there. And then to the east, Russian forces might be the most significant advance of the last week. Russian forces have moved closer to the eastern outskirts of Kyiv. It looks like it's mostly 90th Tank Division, 41st Combined Arms Army from the Central Military District. That's coming from the northern part, and that's the same army that allegedly lost two generals. In the first two weeks of the conflict. There's that really dramatic UAV footage posted, I think it's 2 or 3 days ago, from Bravary showing a Russian armored column. I think it was a 6th Tank Regiment getting struck by our Ukrainian artillery fire, Ukrainian, I think, tank fire, and some questionable tactics at that point. There's also some footage of a very close-in ambush with anti-tank systems in that general area. So it's clear that Russia's trying to advance in that part as well. They're clearly trying to encircle Kyiv from both the west and the east, and yet Ukrainian forces are having success holding them back in both areas. And so it's still a bit of a question of when can Russian forces take the suburbs around Kyiv and try to encircle it. And the southern part is still open, so Ukrainian forces can still resupply food, weapons, and ammunition, all things to Kyiv for the time being. So ultimately, it's not too much has happened, I think, in the last week in terms of Russian advances. Clearly, the fact that they're able to push, armored battalions or maybe a regiment reduced out to Bravary means they can sustain that. They can push forces closer to the capital than they could before. But it's still a question of when can they take those areas. Some questionable tactics. The fact that they're moving in pretty bunched up formation. And this is, only about 20 kilometers from Kyiv. So, clearly within artillery range, clearly on a kind of avenue approach that would be known to the Ukrainians, and some kind of, again, questionable tactics being displayed. And I think also there's still a question of, did Russia use the right units for the most strategic mission to take Kyiv? Because they deployed units from the Eastern Military District, Central Military District. A lot of this, we're seeing very old tanks like T-72As and some very old equipment. And it's a bit of a question of, was that the right move for the most strategic, important target to use? Maybe not your best units. And I think that's something we'll look at in the future. Anyways, that's the overall kind of report of what's happening. So not too much to change the way of advance, but bombardment continues. Certainly devastating strikes continue. And then one thing we've seen more the last few days, we've seen increasing strikes in Western Ukraine. So there was the strikes today in the military facility near Lviv. There have been airstrikes on airfields in Western Ukraine over the last couple of days as well. It's pretty clear that Russia's trying to preempt any kind of additional support from NATO, whether those be MiG-29 fighters or just other kinds of supplies going into Western Ukraine. I think they're trying to make it clear that no part of Ukraine is safe, and if NATO deploys forces anywhere or kind of arms supplies there, that Russia can still destroy those assets. And of course, a lot of this is coming from cruise missiles. It appeared a number of the missiles fired in Western Ukraine were from were a strategic bomber, air launch KH-101 cruise missiles. And clearly, even if you deploy fighters out there, you can't defeat all of them. So that's one thing that's been new. That's kind of a new development that they're obviously trying to signal. And I think some of them probably continue in the future.
Thanks, Rob. And, that was interesting that this week, in fact, in the last couple of days, we've had senior statements from Kadyrov, from Zolotov, the head of Rosgvardia, the National Guard in Russia, saying that they wish the advance was taking place a lot quicker than it is. So it seems like the Russians are getting frustrated that they're getting bogged down. But, I want to get back to this tank ambush that you mentioned, Rob, because that was a really stunning video that showed up at the beginning of the week of this tank column from the 6th Regiment trying to get into Kyiv and getting ambushed on the road in Brovary. And Mike, I want to go to you on this because we talked last week a lot about all the problems that the Russians have had, the morale issues, the problems with their assessments of Ukraine and the concept of operations being bad and problems with logistics and everything else. But I do wonder if there's more fundamental issues that we're not paying as much attention to. And I know you just posted a Twitter thread a few hours ago about how the Russians may not be 12 feet tall, but they're not 4 feet tall either. And I want to challenge you on this. And I'll tell you, I was having a conversation with General Petraeus, who, of course, ran the commanded the 101st Airborne during the invasion of Iraq. And when he was looking at that video, he was just shocked that you would have tanks being ambushed by artillery that way with no recon, no protection. And I was talking to another Marine infantry officer who literally told me he had heart palpitations looking at that video because it just goes against the most basic things that you're trying to do in armor infantry, that you don't bunch up the tanks that close together. You don't put your lead command vehicle out front. He said, it's drilled into you in basic that when you stop, you immediately get out, you establish a perimeter. They weren't doing any of that. And that's not planning. That's not logistics. That is some basic training that seems to be lacking in the Russian military. And I wonder if you had a comment on that. Are we seeing real major problems with some very basic tactics and training?
I think they have some challenges for sure in fundamentals, but 2 points I want to make here. Actually, maybe 3. First, okay, there are a lot of anecdotes, right, that from which we see that they've not done nearly as well on aspects of how they execute missions, how they organize for them. We've also seen pretty significant adjustments within the first week and a half. Second, there are things that the Russian military does that are different from the United States. Okay, I know that may be foreign sometimes to our culture, that actually people do certain things differently. For example, in Russian military, commanders typically lead from the front. The unit goes as the commander. They have very small planning staffs. And that's why often their commanders, including senior commanders, are likely to get killed on the battlefield. Their commanders are likely to go and recon and survey the battlefield in person, much more so towards the front line as well. It's just a slightly different command culture and structure. Okay, that specific episode. Dmitry, I'd be very careful generalizing from that specific episode. So that was a battalion tactical group that clearly had mustered and deployed along a large road, and they had a combined arms mix of forces with them. And their failure was that they had failed to do reconnaissance, and they did not suspect that they were within range of Ukraine artillery. And that's a mistake I've seen them make throughout in this campaign so far in the last 2 weeks. Their reconnaissance has been pretty bad. Early on, they weren't doing convoy escorts. They started to pick that up significantly. They were first operating in small detachments and then started to operate in much more defensible groups. But still, they're being faced by a pretty smart Ukrainian resistance that's forcing them to fight and organize very differently than the way they typically train and fight, right? So I made a post saying that Russian military may, for local wars, generate in battalion tactical groups, but in actuality, in this war, you see them using BTGs as a form of organization to sort of drive around and mobilize, and that's what they were probably trying to do to gather forces. But in general, they have only small engagements, sort of squad-sized fights. Their main enemy is a Ukrainian squad-sized ambush team with anti-tank weapons. They have very few sizable weapons. There's no battalion engagements really in this war, right? And I'm sure that's probably for the Russian military really frustrating them, right? They can't meet an opponent in the field. They can't use their mass. If they concentrate their fires, then they're going to have a hard time actually hitting much of anything because the opponent isn't concentrated. On the basics, I think the big issues where I was surprised that they spent a lot on procurement modernization, and they clearly skimped a lot more on maintenance and sustainment. And on logistics, it's very much a mixed bag. It's actually a different war, depending on where you look, in the North, East, and South. I probably have slight differences with Rob and his interpretation of the battle map in the last week. I don't think necessarily the war is going nearly...
What's your view?
Well, my view is the war is not quite going quite as well. I would say that Russian forces are clearly fanning out to encircle Kiev, both in the west and in the east, and cutting off major arteries. Second, they are trying to cut down towards Izum from the northeast, which is, southeast of Kharkiv. And they're trying to push up from Melitopol in the south, essentially to envelop the bulk of Ukrainian forces in the JFO, the Joint Force Operation of Donbass, right? And they are compressing them slowly. Those are pitched battles, but you can kind of get a gist of their plan and their vision. They are trying to proceed with a fairly large envelopment. And to me, that situation looks a bit precarious. And in the west, they have already half encircled Mykolaiv and are trying to push west of it towards Odessa. I don't think they necessarily have the forces for that push, but it is a significant development. They're clearly not going to fight for the city. They're going around to envelop it and already more than halfway around it. And they're also trying to find another vector northeast towards Kryvyi Rih, but maybe to actually cut some of the ground lines of communications west of the Dnieper River. In the south, they, of course, have rail access, and they can hub out Kherson and Melitopol, so they're able to project power much faster from there. In the northeast, their advance was, very fitful, but very sizable, given they don't have rail access for logistics and they have to truck a lot. So long story short is, Russian forces are taking a lot of casualties in terms of manpower and material, and it's costing them, but they're actually advancing very differently in this past week. They're being more methodical. They're taking a lot more towns and clearing them, trying to secure the routes for their convoys, and they're not pushing it nearly as fast. They're not being reckless, not trying to do thunder runs and some of the wild things that we saw in the first 2 weeks of the war. So, long story short, yes, they have problems with basics and fundamentals. I raised big questions about, which lessons are going to be generalizable from this and which ones are going to be context specific. There's a lot of aspects about this war where there are both things where I'm surprised and also things I see the Russian military fighting in a way very different from the way it's set up in terms of, the way train, fight, concepts of operations, and initial strategy going into this conflict. And I'm sure there's things that, people in the U.S. military would look at and say, hey, I mean, this just looks terrible. U.S. forces wouldn't fight that way. That's fair. I have some thoughts on that. Let's put it this way. I'll leave the thought at this, Dmitry. Not only have I learned, obviously, quite a bit in the Russian military, and you could only see that from a military attempting something like this, which Russian forces haven't done in decades, certainly not since they attempted to reform, modernize this army. I'm also learning a bit about my own defense community's reactions to what it might be like to fight a near peer adversary with some parity of capability, a lot of morale, and the real ability to fight intelligently and inflict substantial casualties and material losses. If that makes any sense, right?
It does. It does. Let me quickly follow up on something you just said, which is that they are obviously having a lot of success in the South, much more than in the North. What do you explain that by? Is that intentional by Ukraine to just give up that area and focus on the North and protection of center of gravity, which is Kiev? Is that because of rail access? Are there multiple reasons for that success?
It's multi-causal. Ukrainian forces were grossly outmatched in the South and had to retreat. Ukrainians made a choice strategically to defend certain parts of the country more than others. Russian military has much easier access in terms of logistics availability and terrain. The forces I think they used from Southern Military District were better in some of the airborne units down there than up in the north. Rob touched on that. For example, if you look at the fighting around Kharkiv, where you saw pressure being applied by elements of the 6th Army and 200 Motor Rifle Brigade, those units are not really designed or optimized for any kind of serious attack. So I'm not surprised they actually hadn't done that well. So there's a whole set of factors, I would say, for why they've, you more have a tale of 3 different fronts on what's happening in this war: the North, the East, and the South.
Got it. Rob, what's your take on the missile arsenal? They've shot a lot of missiles. I think a few days ago, the U.S. estimated that over 700 total have been shot. How many do you think are left? And there was a story by El Nakashima in the Washington Post earlier today that apparently in the last few weeks, they've asked China for assistance. Do you think that they're trying to get some more munitions from China? Are they running out? Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I don't think any of the articles specify what kind of weapons they're looking for from China. For the most part, the Russian military and Chinese military don't operate the same weapon systems. So they have, they use some of the same Mi-8, Mi-17 helicopters, Su-35S fighters, but there aren't that many systems that they share. And Russia doesn't need any, the S-400s or Su-35. So it's not completely clear to me what they're looking for. In terms of munitions, they fired a lot of precision guided munitions. They've used a lot of the ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and we keep seeing convoys in Belarus of more Iskander-M, 9M723 ballistic missiles being moved. Clearly, they're continuing to reload and continue the operation. It's not clear to me how many they have. They've clearly used a lot. We knew in the beginning they had much fewer than, say, what the U.S. or NATO has, and that was going to be a limitation. But they're trying to demonstrate that they can still hit targets in Western Ukraine, even if they can't fly over there, right? And so it seems pretty clear to me that Ukraine still has stronger air defenses in the western part of the country. That's probably why Russian Air Force is not flying over there that much, and why they're choosing instead to use Iskander-M systems or Calibers or KH-101s. So clearly they're trying to demonstrate that continue that if they can continue to strike targets out there, even if we try and say there's a no-fly zone. It's like, okay, well, they can still fire cruise missiles. It doesn't really solve the situation completely. But it is a question of when will they start running out of these munitions. China doesn't have these, right? China does not have calibers. They don't have these same kind of systems. They don't have the Iskander-M. So it's not clear to me what China would provide in that regard, or if it would be.
Could they? They have the Caliber missiles, right? And they have obviously the Grad and the Smersh rockets. So could it be resupply of that?
So they have some of the MLR systems, but Russia should have plenty of stockpiles of those kind of dumb munitions. So when we're talking about precision guided munitions, there are very few that China has that I think that Russia is employing right now that they would need, I think, and maybe Mike has some other ideas. We've seen more recently some other kind of precision munitions being used. So the Russian MODs posted videos of Krasnopol laser guided 152 millimeter artillery rounds being used, which they use heavily in Syria. We saw the first photos of a Kub loitering munition being used in Kyiv. They've tested loitering munitions pretty heavily in Syria as well, but they don't have that many of them in service. So they're trying to use those systems as well, but it's not clear to me what they would need from China. But again, maybe Mike knows better than this than I do.
Mike, any thoughts? Is it drones, maybe?
I mean, I don't like being in a speculation business, so right now there's not much to go on. I'd suspect if there's things they need, it's more technology components like chips, which, actually be hard to get them as much from China, since we know that some of the main ones are made in Taiwan. But maybe they're looking for things they can backfill. This war is going to put Russia behind by several years at least of procurement, and maybe they're running low on some basic stockpiles of munitions.
Okay, makes sense. When do you have any thoughts on the envelopment of forces in the Donbass? Do they actually have enough forces to execute that mission? Ukrainians obviously have quite a few forces in that area. It's a huge area. Do you think they're capable of it? That's to Mike.
No, potential, yeah. Look, one of the challenges is that we're dealing with a fog of war. We don't actually know the state of the Ukrainian forces, and it's not that easy to tell how aspects of this fight are going. So whether or not they can envelop them, they're certainly trying to apply the pressure and trying to push out from both the south and the northeast to make it a pocket or maybe a series of pockets. And attrition takes its toll, right? Like Russian forces have lost a lot in manpower and material. Ukrainian forces, at least from what one can tell, have lost less, but they've lost a significant percentage as a share of what they have available in total, if that makes sense. So those losses count as well.
Makes sense. Back to the equipment, and Rob, maybe you can take this one. I did the math early in the week, and I think it still mostly holds that from all of the videos that people have aggregated of equipment destruction and abandonment by the Russian forces, it appears that over 60% was either abandoned or actually captured by the Ukrainian forces, which to me was just an incredibly high number. Obviously, we don't know what we don't know, and the Ukrainians may not be taking pictures of the totally destroyed equipment. But nevertheless, I just thought that it was a remarkably interesting statistics. Do you have any thoughts on how real it is and what might explain it, Rob?
Sure. So, it's obviously all this is recorded by the Oryx blog. One thing to keep in mind, right, is that it's the observable things that we've seen lost between Russia and Ukraine. You can't really compare them because we're going to see more evidence of Russian losses than we will of Ukrainian losses, because it's more likely Ukrainian citizens will post it. It's more likely Ukrainian soldiers will post that stuff. And the Russian military is they're only catching up now with trying to kind of get involved in the information environment stuff. They were behind on that. The Russian MOD only set up a Telegram channel on March 5th, right? So they weren't prepared for this, and they're only catching up now. So it's one thing to keep in mind is that we're not getting a full idea of the losses and what it means. I think we're seeing more abandoned equipment in the beginning. There's still images being posted now of things that are abandoned. Not always clear if this is new equipment that's been lost or old stuff that's been lost. But I think one of the issues that Russia's had was they went in with very heavy units into Ukraine, and certainly when you're gonna fight against armor or mechanized infantry, it makes sense to have tank battalions. That's quite useful. But I think in a lot of cases, they went with a heavier force than what was required or useful for the situation. And so tanks require a lot more fuel. They require a lot more maintenance, spare parts, all those kind of things, the wheeled vehicles. And so they're much more logistics kind of heavy. And they have much greater requirements. And so a lot of the logistics problems we've had and seeing kind of vehicles that have been broken down, it's like, well, it's mostly, a lot of them are tracked vehicles, right? We're not seeing as many wheeled vehicles get lost or abandoned, and it's not surprising that it'd be harder to kind of support logistically those kind of units. And so part of the issue is that when you're in areas of Ukraine where there isn't maybe a heavy Ukrainian armor presence, well, it's not that useful to have tank units or really heavy units. It's more useful to have lighter units that are better for a maybe kind of more kind of insurgency environment that they're actually facing. I think that's one of the problems they've had is they went in with a very, a force, and we already noticed that the Russian military has a lot more fires, to maneuver units than, say, NATO militaries do. And so part of the problem is that the force they invaded Ukraine with was well designed to fight a conventional fight. It's not very well designed to fight an unconventional fight. In a lot of parts of Ukraine, that's what they're facing, and that's why they're having a lot of problems. And, if you're one or two tanks, or even it's a tank platoon driving around by yourself, and you don't have infantry with you, you're quite vulnerable depending on where you are. And you can see, the Ukrainian territorial defense units are having a lot of success going after those kind of vulnerabilities. It's clear they're focusing on like fuel convoys, which are not prepared to fight or handle kind of any kind of insurgency. And so having a lot of those issues, I think that's one of the problems that the equipment and the type of forces that they invaded Ukraine were not necessarily perfectly designed for the threat they're actually facing.
Certainly something that a lot of militaries tend to make mistakes about. There's a lot of discussion in the last week and a half about the potential for use of nuclear weapons by Russia. A lot of serious people are bringing this up as a real possibility. I'm not in that camp. I don't think that Vladimir Putin would use nuclear weapons unless he believes that Russia and his regime is threatened. And it doesn't seem to me that there's a need to use them in Ukraine. Mike, do you share my assessments of that's just not a realistic possibility?
I mean, depends on the conditions. So if we localize the conversation to Ukraine, no, but it also depends what happens. So, for example, I am worried about some of the trend lines and escalation dynamics between us and Russia writ large. There's going to be Russian retaliation for our sanctions, and it will be asymmetric because we can't retaliate with effective sanctions of their own as much, and we don't know what road that's going to take us down on. But then there's a more significant question. It also depends on what we do, because you can't sort of ask this question in a vacuum. In general, yeah, I think not. I think the likelihood is low. I'm not so sure if the folks that are arguing for things like a no-fly zone actually succeed, because I do see that as a sort of a de facto declaration of war. Then we're in a very different conversation.
Absolutely, yes. And I should have clarified that if there's a war between U.S. and Russia, or NATO and Russia, then everything is potentially on the table. But aside from that, Vladimir Putin does not need nuclear weapons to win this conflict in Ukraine, right?
No, and here's the truth, at least about what I think. I am skeptical that they can achieve their original political objectives in Ukraine. I think those are out the window. I think they're revising their war aims and what victory actually means. I think at this point, what they're going to achieve is a lot less. Right, that's my view, and they're not going to be able to achieve the original maximalist war aims of sort of regime change and installing a pro-Russian government in Ukraine and controlling the state that way.
Yeah, we'll get back to the aims in a minute. But Rob, what are your thoughts on chemical and biological weapons? The U.S. is obviously getting very concerned because the Russians are making noise about these supposed biolabs, which are not really biological weapons labs in Ukraine. They're former installations from the Soviet Union days. They were getting dismantled. And the fact that the Russian propaganda machine is talking about the Ukrainians using chemical and biological weapons is obviously of concern to us here in the West, that the Russians would use it themselves. What's your view on that?
Sure. So the Russian kind of propaganda lines about these facilities in Ukraine or Georgia, they've mentioned for years, right? And they're not really based on any kind of serious information. It's just a way of kind of, I think, deflecting. So it's not surprising they're mentioning those now. They're going to throw up basically anything they can propaganda-wise to kind of justify what they're doing, which obviously, they're losing the information kind of side of this, and they know that. In terms of using chemical biological weapons, I don't think it's likely. And one thing to remember in Syria, so clearly the Assad regime used them numerous times, and Russia refused to kind of acknowledge that. But the Russian MOD a number of times would regularly, put out kind of briefings saying we have information that the Syrian rebel groups are going to use chemical weapons, and they do this all the time, right? It'd be multiple times a year. They put out these kind of notices, and typically nothing would happen. So I mean, I think part of it is just to, I think, just kind of push the same information line that they always push about that. And so I don't think that's particularly likely. But when we go back to the nuclear weapons issue we were talking about before, one of the big issues with this conflict is that clearly Putin thought it was extremely important, right? And he knew there were going to be heavy costs, maybe not as heavy as they are, but he knew there was going to be significant costs to it. So going into Ukraine, it was clearly something that he's demonstrated is very important to him. He thinks it's a very strategically important mission for the Russian, for Russia in general. If he can't achieve his goals, right, and the U.S. overtly takes away that makes it impossible for him to achieve his goals, like a no-fly zone, then there absolutely is an escalation risk that he might escalate in different ways. And when we talk about nuclear weapons, I don't think it's that likely, but it's not something that is impossible at this point. And I think we also remember that right now Russia's conventional military is getting hit pretty hard. They're clearly using up a lot of the precision-guided munitions they would use if they wanted to have a conventional conflict with NATO. And right now, they already deployed 75% of their kind of permanent readiness ground force units into Ukraine, and I guess the estimates is that they've lost 10% of that, whether equipment-wise or casualties. They lost a significant portion of that. So right now, the Russian military, conventional military, is struggling and hurting in a way they have not faced in a long time, right? And even this, you look at casualties. They suffered more casualties in the first week than they probably did in Georgia and Ukraine in 2014, 2015, and Syria of the last 7-8 years combined, right? So, I mean, it is a significant number. It's a significant effect. As Mike said, right, there are going to be significant equipment losses here. They're going to have to, change up the next gauze, procurement plan to kind of compensate for these losses. So we're looking at Russian military right now, the conventional military side, that is weaker than normal and that is more strained than normal. And as long as this war goes on, right, they're already very stretched then, trying to control all these different areas, and they're struggling to deal with all these kind of unconventional tactics by Ukrainian forces in Kharkiv and Sumy and all these other areas where they're attacking Russian supply lines. And so that means is, right, Russia's in a very vulnerable position. And I think also from Putin's perspective, this is a very important mission for him. It's not necessarily going as well as he thinks it is. It is an issue that if it were to fail, right, it would be a thing that could threaten his position at home. And so in terms of escalation risk, right, that's why it's a more dangerous situation than normal, because he can't rely on those kind of things he normally could. And the conventional power isn't nearly as strong right now. It's much more tapped out than normal. So all of those things make this a much more kind of dangerous situation. And it also means that he's more likely to escalate if things are going poorly than if they're going well. And so all that kind of contributes to why the situation is more dangerous than normal, and probably more dangerous than any time in Moscow NATO relations since maybe the early 80s.
That's a great point. And by the way, two things there. The people that are calling for the no-fly zone, as Mike mentioned, are potentially causing a massive escalation here that, if we were to implement that no-fly zone, we would end up in a war with Russia that could result in the use of nuclear weapons. But the other point is, that I think is also important to point out, is that people that think that Ukraine is just step one and that he's about to invade Poland or Romania or the Baltics, perhaps are not appreciating that with the Russian military struggling as much as they are right now in Ukraine, I don't think they're in a position to invade anyone else at the moment and pick up any new fights, and would need quite a bit of reinforcements to compensate for the losses that they've encountered. All right, for those that are joining us, this is Dmitry Alperovich, Chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, and I'm with Mike Kofman of the Center for Naval Analysis and Rob Lee of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Let's talk a little bit about effectiveness of units. Mike, what is your view with all the casualties that Rob was just talking about that they're incurring across the board, including very senior casualties? Do you think that most of the units that they are operating are still quite effective, or are we starting to see real degradation of those BTGs?
I think they've lost some BTGs, and particularly the areas that they got badly mauled, like around Kharkiv. On the whole, though, given the way this actual war is being fought, not nearly as much. So, for example, if you have a BTG and it's a cohesive force and it's engaging other formations, let's say in the field, and it takes substantial losses, right, it can really lose its cohesiveness and its ability to act. In this conflict, a Russian BTG is basically driving around in company tactical groups or even smaller sections and engaging very small numbers of Ukrainian units. Like, these fights are quite small. And so its overall cohesiveness as a larger formation isn't as significant. And actually, the size of the formation is very taxing for the commander to manage, right? Depending on how big the BTG is, they range in size. All those attachments can actually be very difficult for the commander to manage. So my view of it is that, somebody had earlier written, I saw online, and said, hey, if you take out something like X percentage of vehicles in the BTG, it will not be effective and it'll lose cohesiveness. And I'd say, well, in a war, if we were looking at BTGs being fielded in larger formations against an opponent fighting the same way, yeah, sure, maybe. But in this fight, it's a very, very different story. As far as senior commanders being lost, it's really just actually not unusual for the Russian military. I mean, Russian military even lost lieutenant generals in Syria. A major general, which is a 1-star, sort of typically deputy CA commander or maybe army commander or chief of staff, going to the front line and trying to lead from the front, trying to figure out what's going on and getting killed and taking big risks. It's actually not that uncommon for their military. That aspect of just, I think, a big cultural difference.
Huge one. Rob, there was a lot of brain cells being wasted over the last week and a half on this whole Polish MiG question. Will they or won't they supply MiG-29s to Ukraine? We talked on the last Twitter space on Sunday how air defense systems like the SA-6s or the S-300s that some of the former Warsaw Pact members like Bulgaria and Poland have would be much more useful. One of the things that I think was really underappreciated in that discussion is that those Polish MiGs have been upgraded to NATO standards in the last 30 years. NATO communications that obviously wouldn't talk to Ukrainian communication systems, avionics for sure have been upgraded, friend-foe systems. It wasn't even clear to me that the Ukrainians could even fly those planes without some level of training. Was that your view, that was just a completely misguided conversation?
So, yeah, I don't know the details of this. I'm not sure how easily a Ukrainian pilot who's used to MiG-29 could fly Polish ones. I'm not sure what condition Polish 29s are in. I think there are a lot of questions, a lot of unknowns here. I think it's also a question of is the limiting factor here the number of airframes for the Ukrainian Air Force? Because U.S. officials keep saying they have the majority of their fixed-wing aviation. Is the majority serviceable? Are those all in working order? Are they missing spare parts? Is it a logistics issue? Is it a pilot's issue? I don't know what the issue is, right? And there's obviously another issue that Russia has deployed air defense systems in all these areas, and they obviously had some loss earlier. And so the question of does Ukraine want to keep sending fighters into these really kind of dangerous environments where there's a good risk of them getting shut down? I don't know, right? And not to mention, Russian Su-35s are operating out of Belarus. They're obviously trying to conduct a defensive counter-air mission as well. So it's not clear to me what the limiting factor there is with the Air Force. I think in some ways, if we want a more effective option might be TB2s, just because it appears they're still having an effect, right? Still, obviously, you can only make tentative conclusions, but obviously, if you send TB2s into a contested air environment, well, it's not as big of a deal if they get shot down, right? They're not that expensive. You're not losing pilots, and you can keep doing that, right? So I think I think the question to me is, were MiG-29s the most important option? Were they really, was it the airframes that was going to fix the situation? And are there better kind of ways, more cheap and cost-effective ways of improving Ukraine's ability to defend than MiG-29s? I think there probably were, right? And I think probably air defense systems are probably a better option. I think TB2s might be a better option, and I don't know what the relationship with Turkey is with the rest of NATO on this, but obviously they delivered plenty of TB2s to Ukraine. So I think there are other questions to me whether would MiG-29s really have changed the situation that much, and it's not clear to me that that would be the case.
Yeah, and the TB2s, the Turkish drones, seem to have quite an effect in taking out quite a bit of Russian armor, as we're seeing from the videos. One quick follow-up, Rob. Belarus, any more updates on their forces, their air force? Are you seeing any evidence of their involvement in the actual war?
I haven't seen direct involvement. Obviously, Russia's a lot of the Iskander-M launches are coming from Belarus. Obviously, if they want to hit targets in Western Ukraine, they can do so from Belarus. They can't necessarily do that from Russian territory itself. I haven't seen as much evidence of direct involvement. I think it's also a question of how useful would the Belarusian military be going to Ukraine. I'm not sure they'd actually provide that much value. They have some numbers, but they're not really well trained to deal with a conventional fight. And I'm not sure those guys are prepared to kind of go in and face a conventional/unconventional fight in Ukraine. So it might be more of a kind of nuisance to send them into Ukraine than it is to keep them back in Belarus. And I think that might be kind of a contributing factor to this.
Mike, let's talk about the aims of the operation and how they may have changed. One of the most interesting kind of rumors, but seems somewhat substantiated, that have come out in the last few days is the alleged attempt by the Russian authorities that have taken over Kherson, which is so far the largest city that they've taken over, of about 300,000 people, that apparently they want to do referendum there to establish a Kherson National Republic, another one of those statelets like they did in Donetsk and Luhansk back in 2014. That was really fascinating, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. Do you think that they want to split up Ukraine into, a bunch of these statelets in the territories that they take and make sure that it can't function as a country?
I honestly doubt it. I suspect that that's just a pretty good pressure campaign they're pushing in order to show Zelensky that they have a plan B, that they'd be willing to partition the country. That this is essentially a negotiation scheme. I don't think they want a Kherson sort of people republic. Of course, if they're not able to achieve their kind of broader war aims, yeah, I suspect they might be willing to go through with a partition, but I highly doubt that's Russia's first choice. And I think they're organizing these things in order to apply pressure, right, to signal that this could be possible, in order to coerce Zelensky into agreeing to terms.
Right. Rob, have you changed your mind on their ability to take Kiev? You were pretty pessimistic on that last week. What I'm hearing is that supplies in Kiev are not in great shape. A lot of people have left, but there's still 2 million people left in Kiev. So if they actually manage to surround it and siege it, I'm not sure how many weeks food and water supplies will actually last in the city. You may see sort of a siege of Leningrad type of scenario there. What are your thoughts on their prospects in taking it?
Yeah, so I mean, if they're going to siege it, right, and if they're going to do to it what they're doing to Kharkiv, right, I mean, we're getting an idea of what's happening in Kharkiv and how long that can kind of last, right, and hold out. The limiting factor for Ukraine might be, as you said, supplies, right, food, water, all those other kind of things. We know Russian forces have been hitting infrastructure targets, right, and it's not by surprise. So I mean, again, it's really hard to predict this because it's a little difficult to predict when they're going to be able to fully encircle the city. Right, it's taking them some time, and Ukrainian forces are doing a good job of holding back Russian forces on the outskirts. Now, obviously, we're talking about multiple Russian armies here, so they should have the ability to encircle the city at some point. Right, just might take more time, and obviously, all these bridges are getting blown up. That just means it takes more time for Russian forces to move around. Delaying kind of an inevitability there. In terms of taking the city, it's really hard to predict. Ultimately, as Mike was saying, I think what Russia's trying to do right now is they're trying to compel Zelensky to make concessions, right? And they're probably pulling back their kind of maximalist political goals from regime change and installing someone who can kind of run Ukraine to something more limited but still significant, right? And we still see quite strong demands coming from Russian officials, but at least they're more focused on acknowledging, recognizing Crimea and the Donbass, and then saying we're not going to join NATO, we're going to demilitarize, things of that nature. I'm not sure if all of those things will apply, but a lot of it depends on Russia's still progressing, they're still taking territory, and it's a question of if they can fully besiege Kyiv, right? They might kind of once again make those demands, say, all right, do these things, and this is how we stop from leveling the city. If they decide to go in the city, right, it's going to take time, and it's not clear to me how they'll end up. Ultimately, Russia's already taken pretty heavy casualties, right? Every week this goes on, they're taking more casualties from ambushes and things behind the lines and Kharkiv and Sumy and all these other kind of areas. And so, no matter what the front line tells you on these maps, well, Russians are still taking casualties behind those kind of lines, right? And that's why one of those maps are a bit, maybe misleading depending on how you read them. So when we look at the timeline of a battle for Kyiv, it's going to take weeks, right? And if they actually want or try to actually take the city, it's going to take a while. It's not going to be that fast. And even if they devastate it, even if they heavily employ fires like they have in Kharkiv, we're still seeing people in Kharkiv hold out. And I have no doubt people in Kyiv will do the same thing. And it becomes a question of, how many casualties is Russia willing to take Kyiv? And ultimately, it'll be a very bloody affair for them. It's going to take time. And I'm not sure. I think it's a hard thing to kind of predict at this point. But at a minimum, it's going to take several weeks to do so. Several more weeks of this war means, thousands of more Russian soldiers are going to get killed, right? And that means sanctions back and all the other economic disruptions back in Russia are going to start having more an effect. And it's, at a certain point, Russia's going to try and end this conflict, when they can, because they know all these costs are increasing and it becomes a bigger problem over time. So it's I don't know. I'm going to try and avoid making a prediction about how this will go. Only thing we can say is Ukrainians are proving that they're not willing to give up without a fight. And if they fight street by street in Kyiv, it will take a lot of time to take it. And even if Russian forces take it, right, they'll then be facing insurgency in these areas. And not to mention, if you level Kyiv, right, we're already seeing protests in Melitopol and Kherson, all these other cities. Those protests are only get worse, right? And it's only more likely you're going to see more kind of resistance, I think, in those areas that Russian forces will face. So it's not clear to me how it will go, but I think ultimately, if Russian forces level Kyiv, right, and they destroy it and they take it that way, it's kind of hard to see what political goal that achieves, right? And at a certain point, as Mike was saying, it probably makes more sense to say, okay, let's try to negotiate from a position of strength. Let's try and not destroy the city. Let's try and extract some concessions, and then what's in it on those kind of terms, instead of going absolutely leveling the city and taking it that way.
Mike, what's your view on that? I mean, we're getting a preview of what they're capable of in Mariupol, right, where they're decimating the city with artillery. They're fully sieging it. Things are getting very dire in terms of food and water supplies in that city. I'm not sure how long they can truly hold out. Is that what's in store for Kyiv, you think?
Potentially, but I actually have increasingly grown skeptical of the real prospects of a siege. I think that if anything, they'll probably try to encircle the city in the coming 2 weeks and then use that to pressure Zelensky for terms. I'm kind of skeptical that they have the forces to take it. I think I'm on the same page with Rob. That might be an optimistic assessment. That could mean me just sort of advancing, the desirable for the actual, because I obviously don't want Kiev to be turned into a Grozny 1999, 2000 type campaign. But I suspect that given how this has gone, that Russia should be pretty pessimistic about their likelihood of taking the city. Well, I still see Zelensky as essentially the center of gravity, so maybe they figure they can compel him once they have the city largely cut off.
What's your take on, Mike, on the volunteers? They're asking for volunteers to join the fight, including in the Middle East. That seems like, I don't know, an act of desperation. And I'm not clear how they're going to control these people, particularly if they don't have a lot of military training. What's your take on that?
I honestly think that that's somebody's small, silly initiative. That's the kind of thing Prigozhin would do, just to show that, he's contributing to the regime's fight, try to get 1,000 Syrians or so to go into this fight. I don't think that that's a meaningful effort to raise troops. One thing I will say that does worry me kind of about the potential of an urban battle in the capital is it's not Eastern Military District forces that ever concern me about. It's the large number of Chechens they have that are technically part of the National Guard Rosguardia, but are really Kadyrovцы, and they brought more and more reinforcements in. And those are kind of their troops for an urban assault. Their morale is rather high. That's the part that concerns me. Those are the people I suspect they'd ultimately send into the city if they were going to do it.
That's a great point. And Kadyrov put out on his Telegram a few hours ago something implying that he's actually in Ukraine right now, near Kiev. To be determined if that's true or not, but that would be an interesting escalation if he is actually there leading those forces. Let's talk a little bit about the coup prospects. I've been on the record for a few weeks that you now have a non-zero chance of a coup taking place against Putin from the Siloviki faction, from the military, from the intel services. But the one question that I don't think people have explored is, let's assume it does happen, and I want to make it clear that I think it's still very unlikely, very low probability that it will take place. But if it does take place, Mike, what's your view on whoever replaces Putin actually ending this war quickly? I mean, you had, Brezhnev, who launched the war in Afghanistan, and it took only Gorbachev, after Andropov and Chernenko, to end it, and that was a number of years into his reign. So, do you think that if we actually even get a regime change in Moscow, it would end this war?
Yeah, that's a good question. I personally suspect he would. I think in the in the Soviet war in Afghanistan, it was clear to the Soviet Union that they needed to start withdrawing or finding a way to draw down by 83. But you're right, it is Gorbachev that really organized it into a political effort to find a way out. I kind of think that whoever it is, if there is a sort of palace coup, and I am definitely of the mind and have been on the record saying that for the first time, I do think this is the beginning of the end for that regime. I don't have as tremendous longevity. Again, that might be my optimism speaking. I partly think that just because, not just because of the political instability caused by sanctions and the economic catastrophe that this ultimately is for Russia, but also because I think Putin's thrown under the bus important security elements of his own regime. The FSB and the Rosguardia and the army to boot. But whether or not somebody's going to want to end the war, to me, I think all the incentives are there. And one of the biggest reasons why is this is really Putin's war. I mean, I almost feel, looking at how it's gone down and how it's been prosecuted, it's not even the Russian military's war as much. They're fighting it, but so many troops were sort of pushed into this, I think, under false pretenses. And the entire concept of operation is sort of this, was more of a raid than a large-scale military operation. I think only Putin really believed that within 3 days he could somehow get troops into Kiev and get Zelensky to surrender. The entire thing was a botched attempt at quick regime change that the Russian military's tried to now cobble into a serious war effort that's still tremendously unimpressive. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the subject.
Great. Rob, any thoughts on that? The prospects for a coup in Moscow and whether it would end the war?
So it's hard to predict, right? I do think, Putin has set off a kind of, by going to this war, right? Obviously, you can decide when to start a war. It's hard to decide how that war ends, if it will end on your terms, so on. Right? It's always a risky thing, and that's why I thought it was just a very, strategically very, it was a blunder. I think one of the interesting things is, I'm not going to predict whether a coup will happen. I do think that, obviously, Putin has kind of prepared society in Russia to make it difficult to protest. He's obviously, put many of the opposition figures either in jail or in exile. He's made it difficult for independent media to operate, and especially now, it's basically over. And obviously, it seems as though there are plenty of Russians who support this war. Probably a majority. I don't know if we can get a good figure, but it's clearly a sizable number. One thing that's interesting, this is a bit of a tangent here, is that when we talk about the role of Chechens, that they're clearly playing a large role. They've clearly deployed a lot of Chechens to this war, and more so than any other unit, they are posting a lot more videos on social media. Right, Kadyrov's posting this. These guys are taking selfies all the time, and they're making a big deal about this. It's hard to say, how significant a role they're playing, but they're clearly being deployed in larger numbers, right, than most of the kind of units or from other kind of regions. I think it's going to be a really interesting thing to see afterwards about the role it has on kind of the domestic situation in Russia, where it's always going to be a question, once Putin leaves, will Kadyrov be loyal to the next guy, right? Or will he kind of assert more of his own position? And I think right now, if Chechens, continue to take kind of heavy casualties, if they continue to be seen as taking a more key role in this war, I think there's every reason to suspect Kadyrov will say, I want more of a role, and especially whenever Putin goes, that I'm not going to be necessarily loyal to anyone who comes afterwards, and I might become more of a kind of problem for them. So I think that this is going to be another kind of issue in terms of domestic politics that's going to rear its head even more so depending on how this war goes. But either way, it's clear that Chechens are playing a key role, and I think that's going to affect the power dynamic between Moscow and Grozny in the future.
That's a fascinating point because Kadyrov already is barely controllable and can do pretty much whatever he wants, even in Moscow. And that's a great point that if Putin is gone, who will be able to actually keep this guy in line. What do you guys expect? Let's go to Mike first and then to Rob over the next week. Obviously, not a lot has changed this week, although they have made some progress, as Mike pointed out. What do you expect to see happen next week, this coming week? Mike?
I think my view is that Russian forces will make some fitful progress, and they'll probably pay a high price for it. Ukrainian forces will try to maintain position and counterattack where they can to prevent encirclements. War is highly contingent. These things are going to play out in a cycle where Russian forces advance, then regroup, reorganize, resupply, advance some more. And we really don't know what's happening on the negotiation side as well, right? To what extent there's being real progress made between the two sides. So I'm afraid my answer is going to be somewhat disappointing. I think this war is going to go on. The only thing I will add is that I think about a week ago, I had suggested that just looking at the pace of operations and the attrition, the Russian forces like they're going to start facing exhaustion and combat ineffectiveness in the coming weeks, and they're going to need an operational pause. So either way, we may see a slowdown in operational tempo or a ceasefire at the very least where both sides get to rearm, resupply, and replenish their attrition combat units. That's the best I can offer. My general sense looking at this is I think Ukraine can definitely win this war one way or another. They're fighting it quite smartly. I think the Russian ability to achieve their initial political aims has gone out the window now. I think if they substantially reduce their war aims, they might be able to achieve something in this conflict. As for the rest, I sort of reserve judgment, Mitch. I'll just go back on what you asked me originally early on, which is that how do we assess the Russian military based on this? And I'll say I'm going to reserve judgment until the war is over. There's a lot we still don't know. There's a lot we don't know between whether that military is rotten all the way from the feet, or if it's mostly the plan and lack of organization that drove this debacle of intervention and tragic war. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Great. And Rob, your thoughts, and do you think that they're actually going to start hitting convoys of supplies of weapons that are coming over from Poland? They're starting to make noise about the fact that those convoys are fair target. What else do you expect in the coming week?
Yeah, so I'm not sure. I think they could try to show the signal this week that even if you try and do a limited no-fly zone in the western part, that Russia can hit those targets, right? And they're not going to be able to prevent that completely, because there's no way of ensuring you're going to knock down all these cruise missiles if you launch 8 or 10 at a time. So I suspect that they'll continue some strikes in Western Ukraine. They're going to try and limit their use of ballistic missiles and cruise missiles in other parts of the country, just because they're probably running low on them, and they're probably instead just use multiple launch rocket systems, or just bombing from aviation instead. I think the big things to look for this week, this is something we kind of talked about beforehand. For the most part, this war, in rural areas, Russian forces over time were going to defeat Ukrainian forces if they're out in the open, right? So some in a line of contact in the Donbass, some of that area Ukrainian forces are still holding and doing quite a good job. As Mike mentioned, right, there is an increasing risk that they're going to be encircled by Russian forces there, and that is something that's an increase. But the big question right now is just looking at cities, right? It's always been about if Ukrainians are willing to fight for these cities and hold them, then that's going to make it very difficult for Russia to achieve its plans. And so looking at the future, when we look at coming for next week, the big questions are, will Mariupol fall? If it doesn't fall, that's not a good sign for Russian forces for the kind of overall objectives of the campaign. Will Mykolaiv fall? Because if not, it's going to be hard to go Odessa, and they still haven't done that large amphibious assault. People thought it was going to happen, because it's clear that Ukraine still has MLRS systems, artillery, other things in the Odessa region.
MLRS being multiple launch rocket systems.
Correct. Right. They still have those kind of artillery systems that could threaten an amphibious assault. And so as long as Mykolaiv holds out, it's going to be difficult for Russian forces to take Odessa. If Kharkiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, all those cities continue to hold out, and they likely will, because it doesn't seem that the Russia's trying to really seize them, right? It tells you something about how Ukrainians will fight for Kyiv, right? And everything we're seeing is that they will fight. They'll block by block, and it'll be very tough to take. And the last thing to look for is just that encirclement around Kyiv, right? Can Ukraine continue to hold these suburbs? Can they make it difficult and costly if Russia tries to create a tight encirclement of the city? And the longer this takes, right, the more likely Russia will try and end this war with a more compromised solution. And so all those are the things to kind of look for. And again, it is increasingly it's a war for cities. And so what we've seen so far is that there are a couple large cities in the south that did fall to Russia, but none of them were places where Ukrainian forces decide we are going to fight to the last man here, right? We didn't see it in Kherson, we didn't see it in those cities. In the cities where they are doing that, right, they're holding them still, and none of those ones have fallen. And so that's a good indicator of how this campaign is going to continue. And ultimately, a week from now, Russia probably needs to make some significant advances. They probably need to take Mariupol If they do that, that frees up more forces that can move to try to take the rest of the Ukrainian forces in the eastern part of the country. But if these cities continue to hold out, right, it becomes an issue because it becomes a problem for Russian supply lines. Because ultimately, you still have to be able to circle cities. That takes manpower. You have to be able to control supply lines. That takes manpower. And all that pulls away from the actual objective of taking Kyiv or surrounding it properly. So those are the things to look for, I think.
All right. A war for cities. Well, on that sobering, but I think nevertheless optimistic projection from both Mike and Rob, that's a wrap for us. Thank you so much for attending our Twitter space. Thank you, Mike and Rob, for sharing your thoughts with us. We had over 250,000 people listening last time, so I know there's a lot of interest, so we might continue doing these talks if the interest persists. And have a good night, everyone. Thank you.